A Christmas Carol, Part 5. Well, we continue on with Christmas Present. Scrooge promised that he would, and they went on, invisible as they had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost, which Scrooge had observed at the baker's, that notwithstanding his gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease, and that he stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible that he could have done in a lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure of the good spirit had it showing off the power of his, or else it was his own kind, generously hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men that led him straight to Scrooge's clerk. For there he went, and took Scrooge with him, holding his to his robe, and on the threshold of the door the spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinkling of his torch. Think of that! Bob had but 15. Bob, a week himself, he pocketed on Saturdays, but 15 copies of his Christian name, and had yet the ghost of Christmas Present blessed his four-roomed house. Then up rose Mrs. Cratchit, Cratchit's wife, dressed out but poorly in a twice-turned gown, but brave in ribbons, which are cheap, and made a goodly show for sixpence, and she laid the cloth assisted by Belinda Cratchit, second of her daughters, also brave in ribbons, while Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes, and getting the corners of his monstrous shirt collar, Bob's private property, conferred upon his son and heir in honor of this day, into his mouth, rejoiced to find himself so gallantly attired, and yearned to show his linen in a fashionable parks. And now the two smaller Cratchit, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker they had smelt the goose, and known for their own, and basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion. The young Cratchits danced about the table, and exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he, not proud although his collars nearly choked him, blew the fire until the slow potatoes bubbling up knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. "What has ever got your precious father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit, "and your brother Tiny Tim, and Martha, weren't as late last Christmas day by half an hour." "Here's Martha, mother," said the girl, appearing as she spoke. "Here's Martha, mother," cried the two young Cratchits. "Hooray! There's such a goose, Martha." "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are," said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times, and taking off her shawl and bonnet for her with officious zeal. "We'd a deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning, mother." "Well, never mind, so long as you are here," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit ye down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm, Lord bless ye." "No, no, there's father coming," cried the two young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Martha, hide." So Martha hid herself, and in came little Bob, the father, with at least 3 feet of comforter, exclusive of the fringe hanging down before him, and his threadbare clothes darned up and brushed to look seasonable, and Tiny Tim upon his shoulder. Alas for Tiny Tim! He bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. "Where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking around. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming!" said Bob, with a sudden declination in his high spirits, for he had been Tim's blood horse all the way from church, and he had come home rampant. "Not coming upon Christmas Day!" Martha didn't like to see the disappointment, if it were only in a joke, so she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms, while the two Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house that he might hear the pudding singing in the copper. "And how did Tiny Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, when she had rallied Bob on his credibility, and Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful sitting by himself so much, and thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me coming home that he hoped the people saw him in church, because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he thought of this, and he trembled more when he saw Tiny Tim was growing strong and hardy. His active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came Tiny Tim before another word was spoken, escorted by his brother and sister to a stool beside the fire. And while Bob, turning up his cups as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made more shabby, compounded some hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons, and stirred it round and round, and putting on the hot hob to simmer, Master Peter and the two ambiguous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high procession. Such a bustle ensued that you might have thought the goose the rarest of all birds, a feathered phenomenon, to which a black swan was a matter of course, and in truth it was something very like that in that house. Mrs. Cratchit had made the gravy ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. Bob took Tiny Tim beside him in a tiny corner at the table. The young two Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves, and mounting guard upon their post, crammed spoons into their mouths, lest they should shriek for the goose before their turn came to be helped. At last the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit looked slowly all along the carving knife, preparing to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long expected gust of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight across all around the board, and even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hooray!" "There never was such a goose," Bob said. He didn't believe that there ever was such a goose cooked. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of the universal admiration. Eked out by the apple sauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family indeed, as Mrs. Cratchit said with great delight, surveying one small atom of a bone upon the dish that hadn't ate it all at last. Yet everyone had had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onions to the eyebrows. But now the plates being changed by Miss Belinda, Miss Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witness, to take the pudding up and bring it in. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. Hello, a great deal of steam. The pudding was out of the copper. A smell like washing day. That was the cloth. A smell like eating house, and a pastry cook next door to each other, with the laundress next to that. That was the pudding. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding like a speckled cannon ball, so hard and firm, blazing in half a quartern of ignited brandy, and bedlit with Christmas holly stuck into the top. "Oh, a wonderful pudding," Bob Cratchit said, and calmly, too, that he regarded it as the greatest success achieved by Mrs. Cratchit since their marriage. Mrs. Cratchit said that now that the weight was off her mind, she might confess that she had her doubts about the quantity of flour. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought it was at all a small pudding for a large family. It would have been flat heresy to do so. Any Cratchit would have blushed to hint at such a thing. At last dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up, the compound and the judge being tasted and considered perfect. Apples and oranges were put upon the table, and a shovelful of chestnuts on the fire. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one, and a Bob Cratchit's elbow stood the family's display of glass, two tumblers, and a custard cup without a handle. These held the hot stuff from the jug, however, as well as the golden goblets would have done, and Bob served it out with a beaming looks, while the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily. Then Bob proposed, "A Merry Christmas to us all, dears. God bless us." With all the family re-echoed, "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. Bob held his withered little hand in his, as if he loved the child and wished to keep him by his side, and dreaded that he might be taken from him. Spirit, said Scrooge with an interest he had never felt before, tell me, Tiny Tim will live. I see a vacant seat, replied the ghost, in the poor chimney corner, and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, the child will die. No, no, said Scrooge. Oh, no, kind spirit, say he will be spared. Spared. If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other than of my race, returned the ghost, will find him here. What then if he be like to die? He had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Scrooge hung his head to hear his words quoted by the spirit, and was overcome with penitence and grief. Man, said the ghost, if man you be in heart, not adamant, forbear that wicked cant until you have discovered what the surplus is and where it is. Will you decide what men shall live and what men shall die? It may be that, in the sight of heaven, you are more worthless and less fit to live than a millions like this poor man's child. O God, to hear the insect on the leaf pronouncing on too much life among the hungry, bothers in the dust. Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke and trembling cast his eyes upon the ground, but he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. Mr. Scrooge, said Bob, I give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast. The founder of the feast, indeed, cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon, and I'd hope he'd have a good appetite for it. My dear, said Bob, the children. Christmas Day. It should be Christmas Day, I am sure, said she, on which one drinks the health of one such as odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge. You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows better than you, you poor fellow. My dear, was Bob's mild answer, Christmas Day. I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, said Mrs. Cratchit, not for his. Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He be merry and very happy, I have no doubt. The children drank the toast after he. It was the first drink of their proceedings, which had no heartiness in it. Tiny Tim drank it at last of all, but he didn't care twopence for it. Scrooge was the org of the family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for a full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, then there were 10 minutes merrier than before, for the mere relief of Scrooge being done. Bob Cratchit told of how he had a situation and eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 pence weekly. The two young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of Parker being a man of business, and Parker himself, and Peter being a man of business, and Peter himself looking thoughtful at the fire from between his collars, as if he were deliberating that what particular investment he should favor when he came into the receipt of that bewildering income. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a miller's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch, and how she meant to lie about tomorrow morning for a good long rest, tomorrow being a holiday she passed at home. Also how she had seen countless countesses and a lord some days before, and how the lord was much about as tall as Peter, at which Peter pulled up his collar so high that you couldn't have seen his head if you had been there. All this time the chestnuts and the jug went round and by they too had a song about a lost child traveling in the snow from Tiny Tim, who was a plaintive little voice and sang it very well indeed. There was nothing of a high mark in this. There was not a handsome family. They were not well dressed. Their shoes were far from being waterproof, and their clothes were scanty. And Peter might have known, very likely did, the inside of a pawnbroker's. But they were happy, grateful, pleased with one another, and contented with the time. And when they faded, and looked happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the spirit's torch at parting, Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim, until the last. But this time it was getting dark and snowing pretty heavy, And as Scrooge and the spirit went along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in the kitchen parlors and all sorts of was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed the preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and darkness. There all children of the house were running out in the snow to meet their married sisters, brothers, cousins, uncles, aunts, and to be the first to greet them. Here again were shadows on the windows, blinds of guests assembling, and there a group of handsome girls, all hooded and fur booted, and all chattering at once, tripped lightly off to some near neighbor's house, where woe upon the single man who saw them enter. Artful witches, well they knew it in a glow. But if you had judged from the numbers of peoples on the way to friendly gatherings, you might have thought that no one was at home to give them their welcome when they got there, instead of every house expecting company and piling up its fires half chimney high, blessings on it, how ghost exalted, how it bared its breadths of breast and opened its capacious palm and floated on outpouring with a generous hand its bright and harmless mirth on everything within its reach. The very lamplighter who ran on before, dotting the dusky streets with specks of light, and who dressed to spend the evening somewhere, laughed out loudly as the spirit passed through. Little kenned the lamplighter that he had any company but Christmas. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, they stood upon a bleak and desert moor where monstrous masses of rude stones were cast about, and though it were a burial place or giants, and water spread itself whatsoever it listed or would have done so, but for the frost that held its prisoner, and nothing grew but moss and coarse rank grass, down in the west setting sun had left a streak of fiery red which glared upon the desolation for an instant, like a sullen eye, and frowning lower, lower, lower yet, was lost in the thick gloom of the darkest night. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the spirit. "But they know me, see." A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly they advanced toward it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, they found a cheerful company assembled round a glowing fire, an old, old man and woman, with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in with chorus. So surely as they raised their voice, the old man got quite blithe and loud, and so surely as they stopped, the vigor sank again. The spirit did not tarry here, but bade Scrooge hold his robe, and passing above the moor, sped whither, not to see. To Scrooge's horror, looking back, he saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind them, and his ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared and raged against the dreadful caverns it had worn and fiercely tried to undermine the earth. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from the shore on which the waters chafe and danced the wild year through, stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds, born of the wind, one might suppose, as seaweed of the water, rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here, two men who watched the light had made a fire through the loophole in the thick stone wall, shut out a ray of brightness, and an awful sea. Joining their horny hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas in their own can of grog, and one of them, the elder too, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather as the figurehead of the old ship might be, stuck struck up a sturdy song, and was like a gale himself. Again the ghost sped on above the black and heaving sea, on until far away, as he told Scrooge, from any shore that lighted on his ship, there stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow, the officers who had ever watched, dark ghostly figures in the several stations, but every man among them hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companions of some begone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it, and every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had had a kinder word for one another that day than on any other day of the year, and had shared to some extent its festivities, and had remembered those he cared for at a distance, and had known that they delighted to remember him. It was a great surprise to Scrooge while listening to the moaning of the wind, and thinking what a solemn thing it was to move on through the lonely darkness over an unknown abyss, whose depths were secrets as profound as death, in which a great surprise to Scrooge, while thus engaged to hear a hearty laugh, it was a much greater surprise to Scrooge to recognize his own nephew, to find himself in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by his side, and looking at the same nephew with approving affability. "Ha, ha!" laughed Scrooge's nephew. "Ha, ha, ha! If you should happen by any unlikely chance to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I'll cultivate his acquaintance. It is fair, even-handed, noble adjustment of things, that while there is an infection in disease and sorrow, there is nothing in the world so irresistible contagious as laughter and good humor." When Scrooge's nephew laughed in a way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face in the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece by marriage laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends, being not a bit behind-handed, roared out lusciously, "Ha, ha, 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 ha!" "He said that Christmas was a humbug. As I live," cried Scrooge's nephew, "he believed it too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, indignantly. "Bless those women! They never do anything by halves. They are always earnest." She was very pretty, exceedingly pretty, with a dimpled, surprised-looking, capital face, a ripe little mouth that seemed made to be kissed, and no doubt it was. All kinds of good little dots about her chin that melted into one another when she laughed, and the sunniest pair of eyes you ever saw in the little creature's head. Although she was what you would have called provoking, but satisfactory too. Oh, perfectly satisfactory. "He's a comical old fellow," said Scrooge's nephew. "That's the truth. And not so pleasant as he might be, however. His offences carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he's very rich, Fred," hinted Scrooge's niece. "At least, you have always told me so." "What of that, dear?" said Scrooge's nephew. "His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He don't make himself comfortable with it. He hasn't the satisfaction of thinking, ha, 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 that he is ever going to benefit us with it." "I have no patience with him," observed Scrooge's niece. Scrooge's niece, sisters, and all the other ladies expressed the same opinion. "Oh, I have," said Scrooge's nephew. "I am sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried, who suffers by his ill whims, himself always. Here he takes into his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He doesn't lose much of a dinner." "Indeed, I think he loses a very good dinner," interrupted Scrooge's niece. Everybody else said the same, as they must be allowed to have been competent judges, because they had just had dinner, and with the dessert upon the table, were clustered round the fire by lamplight. "Well, I am very glad to hear it," said Scrooge's nephew, "because I haven't had any great faith in these young housekeepers. What do you say, Topper?" Topper had clearly got his eye upon Scrooge's niece's sister, for he answered that a bachelor was a wretched outcast who had no right to express an opinion on the subject. Whereat Scrooge's niece's sister, the plump one, the lace tucker, not the one with the roses, blushed. "Do go on, Fred," said Scrooge's niece, clapping her hands. "He never finishes what he begins to say. He's such a ridiculous fellow." Scrooge's nephew revelled in another laugh, and as it was possible to keep the infection off, thought the plump sister tried hard to do it with aromatic vinegar. His example was unanimously followed. "I was only going to say," said Scrooge's nephew, "that the consequence of his taking a dislike to us and not making merry with us is, I like to think, he loses some pleasant memories which could offer to do him no harm. I'm sure he loses pleasanter companions than he can find in his own thoughts, either in his old moldy old office or dusty chambers. I mean to give him the same chance every year, whether he likes it or not, for I pity him. He may rail at Christmas till he dies, but he can't help thinking better of it. I defy him. If he finds me going there in a good temper year after year and saying, Uncle Scrooge, how are you? If he puts him in the vein to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday. It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good natured and not much at all caring what they laughed at, so they laughed at any rate. He encouraged them in their merriment, and they passed the bottle joyously. After tea, they had some music, for they were a musical family, and they knew they were about when they sung a glee or a catch. I assure you, especially Topper, who could growl away in the bass like a good one, and never swell the large veins of his forehead or get red in the face over it. Scrooge's niece played well upon the harp, played among other tunes a simple little air, a mere nothing you might learn to whistle in 2 minutes, which had been familiar to the child who fetched Scrooge from the boarding school, as he had been reminded by the ghost of Christmas past. When the strain of music sounded, all things that the ghost had shown him came upon his mind. He softened more and more, and thought that if he could have listened to it often years ago, he might have cultivated the kindness of life for his own happiness with his own hands, without resorting to the sexton spade that buried Jacob Marley.